All right, this is from the 9/11 Commission. Fred Fielding is interviewing former Secretary of State under the Clinton administration, Madeleine Albright. Let's see what she has to say.
Secretary, very much for being here and for your service to our commission and to the country. I have a follow-up question very similar to the two that have just been asked you. There was broad consensus among officials, civilian and military, prior to 9/11, that there was little or no congressional support or even public support for a large-scale U.S. military action against Al-Qaeda in the Afghan territory. Likewise, there was skepticism that we've been told about frequently within the U.S. government that the military really was reluctant to engage in any military action against bin Laden in Afghan. And in fact, as the Secretary just said, but for the retaliatory strike after the East African embassy bombings, there was no follow-up. So,
Which, by the way, surprised bin Laden because what bin Laden wanted to do in 1998 after the second fatwa, which was against the United States and its citizens, as well as Jews and Christians throughout the world, was that he wanted to engage the United States in a war in Afghanistan as early as 1998. He didn't do it. And according to Hamza bin Laden, his son, I mean, I think it's Hamza, no, it could be, he has another son who's older now, who basically said that when bin Laden conducted, or was it about the 1998 East Africa bombings, was that he thought that the United States would military engage the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in 98, and that failed because Clinton didn't get engaged. He was much more reserved and didn't want to expend an overreaction of the US military into Afghanistan. That's what bin Laden wanted. Bin Laden knows that he can't beat the US military. Taliban, Al-Qaeda would be no match. What they wanted to do was engage the United States in a long, drawn-out war, just like they did with the Soviet Union. And that's basically what happened. In fact, we engaged for the Soviet Union in 1979. That lasted 10 years. The United States engaged Afghanistan for 20, double. And we left the country to the Taliban, just like the Soviet Union. They left, Taliban took over. The United States left, Taliban takes over. So what happened was that the National Security Council, security of the principles of the security apparatus intelligence, were holding meetings about assassination plots for bin Laden. And the CIA back then, and as I've said before, we're under the strict church committee hearing rules and regulations calling for the CIA to tone down its rhetoric regarding and its operations, black ops, regarding assassinations and the like. And so George Tenet, the DCI, Director Tenet, basically was trying to reform the agency from being, this old Cold War, stale agency, and he wanted to improve it. But in order to do that, he had to rub some elbows with some high league officials in the State Department, in these charity meetings that, these donors and whatnot. So bin Laden didn't engage in any conflict with the United States, and the United States didn't engage bin Laden in Afghanistan when I think they should have. Now, Clinton was given numerous options to assassinate bin Laden, and that's coming from even the chief of station of Alex Station, the bin Laden issue station, Michael Scheuer. And at times, Richard Clarke would basically sometimes go along, but Clinton worried about angering the Saudi kingdom. They were trying to repair relations with them, even going back to the Carter administration, who catered to the Saudi lobby. And when Reagan took over, the Saudis were basically ignored. And Bush took over and than Clinton. And basically, the repairing of the kingdom's relationship began in the latter stages of the Bush administration. And so what happened was that Clinton didn't want to inflame any relations or interfere with any relations with the Gulf. And so that's why the FBI was given orders throughout the 90s not to offend Arabs in general. And that's one of the reasons why El Sayed Nocera got off for murdering a Jewish radical by the name of Rabbi Meir Kahane, who's the founder of the Jewish Defense League. And he was murdered in cold blood by El Sayed Nocera, who's dressed up as a Jew and in a hotel in Manhattan. And he got convicted of a gun charge, but his lawyer, William Kunstler, got him off of murder, which was unbelievable. But just goes to show you that the power of the Saudi lobby and the State Department basically, and the FBI basically got together and tried to protect their interests. So Clinton was given numerous options to assassinate bin Laden, and he never took it up, even when the CIA basically offered to do so in Khartoum, Sudan. But when he got to Afghanistan, it was a little bit too late.
We have the State Department communicating threats to the Taliban, saying that, and I guess it was around 1999, that they would be held accountable and that there would be military force, among other things, for any attack by Al Qaeda against the United States. Now, that leads my question: did the Taliban have reason to believe that we would make good on that threat, that it was a valid threat? And likewise, what steps, when you formulate a policy to make that kind of threat, what steps did you take to ensure that we, in fact, had a credible military force that could enforce that?
Well, first of all, as I said, President Clinton had ordered that lethal force be used. There were armed submarines in the Arabian Sea and a variety bombers on standby and ready to go, so that the orders were there. The president also asked for a variety of options from the Pentagon in terms of special forces, a variety of, as far as I know, there was no option off the table, and that there were questions about the Pentagon saying that these were not viable.
Okay, she's actually right here. Okay, so during the national principals, all right, the national security briefing meetings, or the principals meeting of the leading members of the Pentagon and intelligence apparatus and White House, like Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Joint Chiefs of Staff, FBI Director of the CIA, the DIA, whatever. They have these meetings and they talk with Richard Clark, who's the counterterrorism coordinator, right? Okay, so during these meetings, they talk about threats to the country. And of course, Al Qaeda started popping up right around 97, 98, after the first flat war in 96, right? But the terrorist attacks really didn't start until 98. Okay, that's the embassy bombings. Before that, we had the bombing in Yemen of a hotel in 1992, and then you had Khobar Towers, but none of these were really attributed to Al Qaeda, even though the first bombing in Yemen was attributed to Al Qaeda, but it wasn't. Nobody really knew anything about Al Qaeda. 1998, things started to change because of the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Tanzania and Kenya. The Al Qaeda organization and bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Mohammed Atef, the military commander, basically put themselves on the map by doing so. And so the Clinton administration started holding these meetings and took Al Qaeda much more seriously than, say, the Bush administration did in the first couple of months that he was in office, even all the way till September 11th himself. It wasn't until after 9/11, of course, that, hey, by the way, we should make international terrorism a number one priority. Clinton had international terrorism as his priority, but he didn't want to basically, like I said, offend his interest in the Gulf and engage in any type of really assassination plots. Now, during these briefings, they would have a number of scenarios how to kill him. Now, Clinton is also the president who started the rendition program, not Bush. It was Clinton. It started under President Clinton, the rendition program. It became much more pronounced under the Bush administration after 9/11. Now, with Clinton, he was offered to kill bin Laden in Khartoum. He declined. He said it was too risky. And then in 1998, after the embassy bombings, the Pentagon asked the CIA about using the new technology called the drone apparatus, where they could use the drone to shoot at bin Laden at a wedding party, for example. It was a wedding party. And this was discussed. The CIA actually, under Director Tenet, basically said, no, we're not an assassination club. That changed real quick, didn't it, after 9/11? Now they have kill lists with the CIA. And the Pentagon actually, negated to engage with the drone apparatus as well. And there was, a number of discussions about assassinating bin Laden in a meeting with Saudi princes. And they said no, because we would offend and, destroy relations with Saudi Arabia. By the way, it's all based on oil regulations. That's all. But, the United States has their interests, and it comes from money, not from, threats to national security. They don't give a damn about that. But yeah, Albright is right here, even though Albright herself is a, sociopath. And if, why I'm saying that is because Albright's in that infamous 60 Minutes interview where she's being interviewed by, I think, Jane Stanley. No, I'm sorry, not Jane Stanley. Goodness gracious. That's from the BBC. I forgot her name. And she asked her, was the price worth it engaging Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War, which killed 500,000 men, women, and children? And Madeleine Albright said, without any hesitation at all, she goes, it's a tough question, but I think the price was worth it. So, I mean, you got to start thinking in terms, if you're going to understand these people, you're going to have to really step outside yourself and think in terms of a sociopath or a psychopath. It's hard to do, but you have to show why these people don't engage or engage in conflict and don't engage the threats before it's carried out.
You will have Secretary Cohen here, and you can ask him these questions, but I do know that from the perspective of one of the members of the Principals Committee, IS Secretary of State, can assure you that the president asked for a variety of military options. And so
but he never approved of it.
Again, think that you have to, from my perspective, the Pentagon did not come forward with viable options in response.
That's a little bit disingenuous on your part. The Pentagon surely did. The CIA surely did. And the Clinton administration didn't pull the trigger. And this was the argument with Clinton, was that, hey, you had numerous chances to kill bin Laden, more so than Bush. I mean, this is going back to when bin Laden was in the Sudan, and they didn't do it.
To what the president was asking for.
I also think, Mr. Fielding, that the record is pretty clear on the intensive looks that we were giving to the target lists and what could be found and how to find Usama and could we see him. And we found that we may have seen him, but he wasn't there, or perhaps he was going to be someplace, but it never panned out. But there are very clear indications using.
Yeah, he's right. I mean, there were times when, while he was in Afghanistan, that there was information coming from warlords in Afghanistan, neighboring warlords against the Taliban, like the Northern Alliance. They had their own spies as well. And that's under Ahmad Shah Massoud, who were fighting the Taliban at the time in a civil war for the country. Okay, so you did have some spies in the Northern Alliance and the Eastern Alliance, who basically were conducting scouts. But that, I mean, the information was pretty vague and it wasn't definitive. So you can't take action on it unless you're willing to kill, like, for example, if they wanted to kill bin Laden when he was having a meeting with Saudi princes, and you kill like 30 or 40 of these people, but you kill bin Laden, I mean, after 9/11, that would have been a no-brainer. They don't care. Before then, there was some hesitancy on the Clinton administration to conduct the operation. That happened many times.
Afghan irregulars who were prepared to work with us using the kinds of strikes that we used against the camps. looking at all of the other alternatives. This was a constant preoccupation that we had many times when I would have phoned the secretary on the secure phone and say, we think it's about to happen, only to call her back 24 hours later and say, no, it didn't work. The intelligence wasn't secure enough to know that we would be there to hit that particular
Almost
target.
like kicking the
Some of
can
it
down the
was.
road.
So it was not something that sort of was done once and put aside and never thought about again.
No, I appreciate that, but to get back to the second part of my question, when you formulate a diplomatic policy, if you will, which says we're going to use force against you, and we're going to use our military if you don't resolve this in a diplomatic sense, my real question is, what process do you go through before that decision is made to ensure that we really did have a credible military plan and force that could react to that, to make our threat to the Taliban credible?
Well, we did, and Ambassador Pickering participated in many of these meetings. We had interagency meetings to talk about what our various options were, and I think we all felt it was appropriate to let the Taliban know that they would be held responsible if further action were held. And as we made that, the truth is that they didn't do anything in between the time that we made that point to them. And it was a threat that was out there, a Damocles sword. And we did have various options to deal with them, with the cruise missiles off the submarines and other ways of bombing. I personally am not satisfied that.
All right, let me interfere. In 1998, late 98, all right, the Taliban were holding a high-level meeting with the leading officials in Pakistan. Taliban's from Pakistan originally, right? They're actually a creation of the ISI, the intelligence services there, right? All these religious, mullahs coming out of like Islamabad and Jalalabad that were replacing the Afghan nationals in the Soviet war. So you have a large contingent of these people coming out of these schools who basically saw the war as a religious, spiritual war that was much more fervent than, say, a leading Imamic scholar like Abdul Azam. Azam saw the war as a spiritual war, a defensive jihad, a spiritual jihad. But what these guys wanted was basically to force Afghanistan or make Afghanistan into a caliphate, an Islamic country, because they saw the dangers of socialism and communism in the country throughout the last 30 years. So the Taliban basically were holding a meeting in 1999 about the bin Laden problem. 1998. And throughout that year, one meeting was between the Taliban, and the leader of the Taliban in Afghanistan was by an individual by the name of Mohammed Mullah Omar. Okay. Now, the Saudi General Intelligence Director, Prince Turki bin Faisal Al Saud, held a meeting with Mullah Omar about the bin Laden problem. And he said basically he was there under the auspices of the United States as well. And what he told Mullah Omar was basically, look, you don't want bin Laden in your country. He's been a headache. Extradite him to us. And Mullah Omar basically said, well, what happens then? And he says, well, he's extradited to the United States. So the Taliban officials from Pakistan met with Mullah Omar in Afghanistan. And this was the priority. And this is more descriptive in the book Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, written by Ann Sterenson, which is basically the best book I've ever read regarding the history of Al-Qaeda and their relationship with the Taliban. And she actually lives in Afghanistan and reports out there. She's from the, I'm going to be remiss here, and I can't think of the institute she worked with Thomas Hedgehammer, and these are experts, the best in the world, right? So basically what she wrote in the book was that the Taliban held this meeting and they declined when the United States sent those cruise missiles in response to the embassy bombings. They were that close to getting rid of bin Laden, to deport him. But what really persuaded them to do otherwise was that if they handed a fellow Muslim to a non-Muslim country, such as the United States, that the rest of the Islamic world would deem the Taliban as un-Islamic. And they would condemn them, and that would be the end. But when the response came from the Clinton administration to use cruise missiles on Afghan training camps, that was really the turning point, because Mullah Omar then said that we were at war with the United States.
We were able to get all the right answers out of the Pentagon. I think that is a question. And one of the issues always in
What the United States should have done, what they should have done was sent a representative either from Saudi Arabia or from the Defense Intelligence Agency, like they did with Julie Sears, when she was commiserating with Ahmad Shah Massoud in the Northern Alliance. They should have done was sent a representative from the kingdom and said after the embassy bombings, you may want to think this over and hand bin Laden over, because the United States is going to get involved, and they're involved the military in the country before the missile strikes hit those camps. Before the missile strike hit the pharmaceutical company in Khartoum, which was not Al-Qaeda affiliated. By doing so, they go to the response from the Taliban to say no. If they didn't do that, they probably would have handed bin Laden over, and then we wouldn't have this problem. We wouldn't be where we are right now.
Interagency meeting, whether it was starting when I was ambassador at the United Nations, I would ask for a variety, although at that case, not as appropriate as when I was secretary, for a variety of options in terms of what could be done militarily. And I think you will have to ask Secretary Cohen, because we all dealt on this issue together. And I think that the thing that is very hard to explain to people now is how much time we spent on all this, and we're constantly debating what we could do given a pre-9/11 atmosphere. It really was very, very different. And most people thought that we had made up the issues of terrorism, as Secretary Laden pointed out. So I hope very much that in considering all this, you do, I know how hard it is for me, and I'm sure it's hard for you, is to get back into the
Yeah, it's impossible. Anyway, look, problem here resides with the inaction of the Clinton administration in the early 1990s in assassinating bin Laden when they could have in the Sudan. And then afterwards, when he returned to Afghanistan in 1996, was the missile strike reaction, which we shouldn't have done. What bin Laden wanted was an overreaction by the military to engage the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan like they did after the World Trade Center attacks. But it took the World Trade Center attacks to do that. And it took a reactionary like Bush to do that. Clinton was not a reactionary. Clinton was much more cerebral than, say, Bush. But on the same time, he was very indecisive in that Bush was quite decisive. In fact, when 9/11 happened, he said, send everybody there. I mean, everybody and their mother went to Afghanistan, and they basically destroyed Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in the CIA operation, which was Jawbreaker, which, I've done a video on, and you could look it up for yourself to know more about it. I'm probably going to do a podcast episode this weekend based on the hunt for bin Laden and Jawbreaker, which is huge. A great story in return. But yeah, no, Clinton, hey, listen, Clinton doesn't get a free ride here. He basically had his chances. He blew it. He basically was indecisive when it came to bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda problem. And that grew into a huge problem, which Bush tended to ignore in the year 2000. And then when 9/11 happened, it was much too late.